Good morning. We have just heard a thought-provoking message. Thank you for raising our awareness this morning as you have. I'm honored to be here. I trust that our time today will have been well spent. It is good to see each and every one of you, and those of you who have come from near and far. It's good to have you here, and I'm honored to be a part of this. I want to get right to the message that has been assigned to me. It was quite an interesting thing, as David said, when Scott contacted me several months ago to invite me. He said, "Robert, we want you to speak from Romans." So right away I accepted, because I have a real good sermon out of the book of Romans. And then he said, "I want you to speak from chapter 12. And I thought, that's not the one. Nevertheless, the scriptures read as follows. "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." I've been asked to share some things with you concerning renewing minds and reshaping communities. Much has been done in those regards all across the land. We at the Schrader Lane Church of Christ have had the blessing of God's permission and His trust to have had a hand in that. Renewing minds and reshaping communities. Those of us who live in Nashville are clearly aware that our community is quickly being reshaped. Just in the vicinity of the congregation, of the building, we see changes daily. I see people now walking on Jefferson Street, Ed Temple Boulevard, and the surrounding areas that once were typically low-income areas. Those are now changing rapidly. Some of the persons who had lived in those communities in the past are no longer able to live there because the community itself is being reshaped. Just as that is true in this city and in the various places from which we come, the world is changing, and the church must be a change agent to call the world to Christ. So it is our mission, it is our task, it's our job, it is our calling to be involved in transforming the world. One of the things that I would like to emphasize today is that there is a reason that we should become transformed. When I read this thought-provoking passage, the writer, Paul, says, "I beseech you, I implore you that you do something here that's important. By the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice." A living sacrifice. And then in verse 2, "And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds." Why should we become transformed? Those of us who particularly have been religious persons for most of our lives quickly become set in our ways, and we must be reminded that transformation is necessary for us because we must be transformed in order to transform someone else. Verse 1 tells us that it is an urgent matter. "I beseech you, I implore you, I admonish you." And this reminds me of 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, where the scriptures tell us that the devil goes about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. This is a matter of urgency. It is urgent that those of us who are children of God become transformed so that we will have the ability, the stamina, the know-how, and the points of reference from our personal experiences to be able to transform others. It's important because God has been merciful to us. There's something about recognizing and appreciating the mercy of God. The Bible, Christ said it well in the Beatitudes, Matthew chapter 5, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." You and I have the privilege of changing one another, of changing the communities in which we live and those whom we influence, because we know that God has been and is merciful to us. And knowing that God is merciful to us, we have all the reason in the world to be merciful to others. And it is also important to recognize that it is reasonable, according to this passage, verse 1, your reasonable service. The NIV calls it your spiritual service. The Standard Revised calls it your spiritual worship. We have responsibility to be transformed so that we can transform others. Not only is this true, but this speaks of the renewing of our minds. When we read the passage, be transformed, how? By the renewing of your minds. Well, how should we become renewed in our thinking? And how do our minds make a difference in this process? What is it that needs to be changed? My thinking. Well, Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7, we're all familiar with it. It tells us, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Our minds. We, in order to be able to transform our communities and those around us, must have our minds changed. All the experiences of life are experiences that collectively alter for the better our minds. Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, one of my favorite passages, and you spoke of those unfair finalies. Finally, my brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, the scripture says, think on these things. So if I am going to position myself to effectively be a transformer, someone who can reshape the community, and community has many definitions, by the way, I must be one who thinks on things that will change my mind and improve my mind. Change thinking is important. The mind that you and I must have is the mind of God. We must think along the path that God would have us think. And I refuse to immediately say, let's do this and let's do that so that we can change the community. The problem that we have collectively is that we must spend more time changing our minds. Many times we look at the community about us and we see persons who are unlike ourselves, persons who may look differently. Perhaps they are persons who have a different background in terms of their social and economic status. Many times we look at persons whose educational background is different from that which we were blessed and fortunate enough to achieve, and we don't feel a connection to them. Sometimes the differences that we have are as subtle as age and generations, but that's not the mind of God. In Romans chapter 11, the verses 34, the scripture proclaims the awe of the mind of God, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who have known the mind, that's what we're after, the mind of the Lord. and who has been his counselor. You and I seek to have the mind of God. Renewed minds are godly minds. One of the challenges, this is on a personal level, that each one of us has is that we must be godly persons consistently to have the greatest impact on those around us and certainly on the community around us. Renewed minds are peaceful minds. Philippians chapter 4, verse 7 tells us about that peace that surpasseth understanding. And what a wonderful effect it has on our minds. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. Something that from my childhood and many of us who have a background in the Church of Christ recognize this scripture telling us, and there that word again is beseech in the King James. I implore you, I admonish you, that you all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and the same judgment. There it is again. So a renewed mind is a unifying mind. As we come together this week with the concept of unifying the core, it's essential that we not find ourselves belittling the spirituality, undermining the grace, having predispositions regarding the effectiveness of one congregation versus another, because renewed minds are unifying minds, and we can all give ourselves a personal test to determine the degree to which our minds have become unified. Renewal, briefly stated, is an ongoing process. Many times we like to say, well, I've become a Christian, so I am renewed. But in the original text, the concept of renewal is ongoing. It is an adjustment of our moral vision and thinking to that of the mind of God. And I know in my life that is an ongoing process. And we're able to be transformed only by the renewing of our minds. What should be transformed? Well, there are two things in this passage. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. And the original word here that is translated as bodies is really talking about the physical body, the soma, the use of our bodies. We must use our bodies in God's work. It's insufficient to say, I'm a godly person, I'm a spiritual person, but I have no effort in the Lord. Living sacrifices, if you will. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 through 20 tell us, of course, that our body is the temple of the Lord. The body does lots of things. Over in Acts chapter 20, when Eutychus fell out of the window as Paul was preaching, his body was there at worship. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, forsaking not the assembly. Our bodies must physically be there. So if I want to be transformed, I truly need to have my body engaged in that. And then the good part. When you talk about the works of the church and the works of a congregation that enable us to reshape communities, that sounds like an awesome task. Reshape communities. I love a passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 10 and 11 that say this so well. I grew up in a small town. We had a garden. And one of the things that my mother and father did was to, in the fall, sow turnip greens. Any of you all know about turnip greens? Oh, Scott likes turnip greens, I can tell. They sowed turnip greens. This passage in verse 9 reads as follows. As it is written, he hath dispersed abroad. He hath given to the poor. His righteousness remaineth forever. Now he that ministereth seed to the sower, both minister bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness. I'll stop with that. The beautiful concept here is that for us to reshape communities, we, now having been transformed, have to become sowers. This passage is saying, in short, that God blesses those who sow and not those who hoard. There's a huge difference. When my father would go out and till the soil and get the soil very granular, then my mother would come along with turnip seeds, and she would sow the seed, and I can still visualize her doing that. I think she's here today. My mother's 90 years old. You hear Mom wave if you're here somewhere. I think she's here today with my sister. And she would sow those turnip seeds, and turnip greens would come up. And in the fall, we would go out, we would pick the turnip greens, and our neighbors would come by, and they would ask if they could have some turnip greens. And my mother would give them a paper bag or a plastic bag and say, sure, go out there and pick yourself a mess. You all know what a mess is? A mess of turnip greens. And since our neighbors knew that we went to church every time the doors opened, in fact, my father often opened the door, then they also came by with their own sacks while we were at church and picked themselves a mess. And we didn't miss them a bit because God allowed us to be sowers and not hoarders of the seed. For you and myself to be able to change our communities, we have to be transformed with a mindset that is willing to be a sower and not a hoarder. We have to do things of that nature. I want to highlight just 4 or 5 things that we do that make an impact. The first one is the Christian Community Service Incorporated. About 20 years ago, 2 very distinguished gentlemen with vision for sowing put their minds together, and the churches for which they ministered came together. Brother Rubel Shelley and Brother David Jones Jr. I believe both of them. I know Dr. Jones is here this morning. Dr. Jones, where are you? Just stand up right where you are. There he is, right there in front of me in the audience. Brother Shelley, if you're here, please stand as well. These men put their minds together and saw that there are a variety of underserved neighborhoods in the Nashville community, and decided that they could no longer just look at that, but do something about that. And we're talking about seriously changing communities. In the 20 years that the Christian Service Organization has taken place, big things have happened in the lives of individuals. And let me confess to you, as I thought about this, at first I said, I won't share the numbers with them because the numbers will sound as though they're boasting. And I only want you to know the concept. But I've repented of that, and I've decided that I want to share some numbers with you because I want us to all be convinced that the church can indeed reshape the communities. Here's the impact in some statistical measures, not the full measure, but just statistical measures. Since 2000, those persons who have been engaged in learning, these are underserved, poorly educated, low on the financial totem pole persons. Frequently they are mothers who are the single heads of households with children. Often they have not completed their high school education, much less gone very far in the arenas of higher education. So it's important to be able, being transformed persons, being renewed in our minds, to become transformers, to make a difference in the life of someone who simply needs guidance. They began mentoring to independence, where volunteers from the Woodmont Hills Church and the Schrader Lane Church would go multiple times a week and sit with families, adopt families, and help the mothers and fathers in some cases through financial peace type learning so they could learn to begin to manage their money. Began to tutor the children so that they would get the confidence to do well in school. Began to have experiences where those persons who, frankly, had been in generational poverty, from one generation to the next. Many had lived in public housing as children and now as adults, and honestly saw no hope of changing that for their children. Matched those persons with members of the congregations who were willing to help them see the possibilities. The numbers say this: there have been housing sales where 115 families have moved out of subsidized housing into housing that they own. 115 families. That's reshaping the community. Yes. The financial impact of that is that those home sales have added up to $13.7 million over those years. The estimated cumulative property tax that those firmly based citizens have paid has been in the neighborhood of $1.2 million. Don't you know that changing the perspective of those persons has been influential in reshaping the community of Nashville, not just their immediate area? There have been subsidies over the years that would have been paid for taking care of those persons who weren't able to take care of themselves. And because of their graduating through the transformative experience, those subsidies declined by $3.3 million. That's an impact that reshapes the community. And simply stated, we have the ability, each person has the ability, each congregation has the ability to make a difference. Then there is the David Jones Jr. Assisted Living Center, where those who aren't able to take care of themselves get the great care of members of the church and a capable medical staff that does all the things that are necessary. That has changed the community, and it has changed the lives of those persons who would have been stuck in a lesser facility were it not for a low-cost, high-quality assisted living center on a church campus that changes a community. Tutoring. Children come twice a week during the school year, and they're tutored by volunteers. That changes the perspective of those children forever. So as I near a conclusion, those are some examples of how, if we put our minds to it, we can reshape the community. How do you do that? Ultimately, according to this passage, if we continue with verse 3, it really tells us to do it in a way that is not high-minded. I have to be willing to be with people who are better off than me and people who are doing not as well as me to really make a difference in the community. Using seeds of gifts. Verses 4 through 8 of this passage deal with the gifts that God has given us, the spiritual gifts, if you will. Every person who is a child of God has a spiritual gift. And I believe that you and I can use our spiritual gifts to change the communities around us. And then the summary. Our collective transformation is a matter of urgency. Our minds must be continuously transformed. Our bodies are transformed so that we can serve and transform others. The reason God blesses us and trusts us with transformational experiences is so that we can share them with someone else. And when we are transformed, we can reshape communities. May God bless you, and may God strengthen you in your resolve to make a difference.